Oh, there we go. Sorry. Having all kind of technical problems this morning. Sorry, we got it going now. So hopefully folks will find this. I didn't put the link up as I meant to. So I'm going to go ahead and do the show, and then I'll post the link to it. And you can, if you're not finding it live, you can certainly find it recorded. So in fact, what I think I'll do, bear with me here just a second, because I want to make sure folks have the chance to see this. Yeah, it's on right now. It's listed under, let's see if I go to my page. Yeah, it comes up. Hold on. If I go to my page, there, okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Blackboard, and I'm going to log into Blackboard, and I'm going to go to our class, and under announcements, I'm going to say Monday, August 3, YouTube session link. Okay. All right, so that's posted. I got to do the same thing for the other two classes. I'll do that ASAP. But anyway, all right, so I see a few folks have found their way in. Once again, I come running down the stairs and fire everything up. It makes me hot. But we got to finish things up today. So let's look at our situation. Let me go open up everything, and we'll see what we got to do, what's going on. I believe I got everything graded for all the classes as of last week. So I don't think there's anything. If there's anything left that needs to be graded, it's things that came in late, or I granted some kind of an extension under extraordinary circumstances or something like that. So I think we're good to go. The only thing left to do now, you might still have a video quiz you need to do. I'm not sure. It depends on what the timeline is for those. In fact, I'll just check here. I've got it open. So let's see. The final exam is already up. You can take it anytime through, I guess, Friday. Yeah, through Friday the 7th. The second video quiz is up. You can take it anytime through Friday. That's it. Okay, those are the last two things. I've already graded both papers, I think, and that should all be squared away. So I think we're good on that. So let me look at the syllabus and make sure there's any other things we need to talk about, and then we will get on into our last little bit of medieval Europe. Summer 1, there it is. Okay. Let me go ahead and share the screen. Okay. Fall semester starts in 2 weeks from now. As soon as this semester is over this week, we go straight into opening week, which is faculty meetings starting next Monday, and then 2 weeks from today, fall semester starts. So we're just on the express route. All right, so let's see. I'm going to blow this up so you can see it a little bit better. All right, so we're to the very end now. This is the week of August 3rd. That's today. We're going to finish medieval Europe. We'll talk about how the final exam works for anybody that hasn't taken it yet. I don't think very many people have taken it yet. I just wanted to make it available in case people needed to be able to take it during the weekend as opposed to during the week. So the final exam will cover Section 5, Byzantium and Islam. Section 6, India and China. And then this long medieval Europe section. Let me see if I can make that pop up. So Stephen says, how many essays will there be on the test and how many do we need to do? I believe that there are 3 possibilities of essay on the exam, and you pick one. You pick one. I never have students do more than 1 essay on an exam. All right. So I think we are good on that score. Oops, I needed that. So let's go over, and that's cool. Any other questions? Just put them up there. And let's finish up medieval Europe, and that'll be it. We'll be done, man. In fact, it's interesting. I was just, we're going to talk about one of the last, I think the last thing we're going to talk about today are the Wars of the Roses in England and France. Well, in England and how it tied into the 100 Years' War in France. And I was just listening to it when I was in the shower a while ago. I was listening to the History Extra podcast from the BBC, and they were talking about the life of King Henry VI, who was the last Lancastrian king before the Yorks won out, and then the Tudors, of course, ultimately leading to Queen Elizabeth, Henry VIII, and all that. So got a little more information about that than I normally would because I was just listening to a British professor talking about it. That was pretty cool. All right, so I made a note and lost it. I made a note that we were to the Magna Carta. Okay, good. Hey, that worked out. So, aha. All right, so I was talking, I believe, at the end last time about the beginnings of the English language, and the Canterbury Tales was the first story written using an early form of English instead of Latin or Germanic, that kind of thing. And so the English language is relatively new in the grand scheme of things, and it's kind of the English language is a kind of a clumped together language, but that's one of its strengths. I love the English language. I think that one of the things that's so great about it is that it has so many different sources. It's come together from so many different places all over the world that have contributed pieces to it, that it has many different ways of saying things, which is which is very useful as a writer, for example, because languages that are very insular, you really have one way of saying things, and you can't be very artistic. You kind of, if you're trying to say the same thing 3 times, you have to say it exactly the same way all 3 times. Whereas English lets you say basically the same thing a dozen times in a dozen different ways because there's so, many different ways of saying things. Now, that makes it more difficult for someone who is not a native English speaker to learn English because there's so many, it's just a gigantic box full of different ways of saying the same thing, But on the other hand, once you do learn English, it gives you just this enormous palette. If you think of language as like an artist with a palette full of colors, some languages you have a red, a blue, a green, a yellow. English gives you 20 shades of red, 20 shades of green, 20 shades of blue, and so it's more difficult. You have to be a lifelong learner. I mean, I've studied English my entire life, and I've still got a long way to go, but I feel like I'm a pretty proficient user of it. So it's an interesting language just because it came together in bits and pieces from so many other languages, and it's a fairly new language, and it doesn't even always sound the same over time. Again, compare the King James Bible to a modern translation of the Bible, and it doesn't even sound the same at all. Okay, so the Magna Carta gets us back into politics a little bit, and if you've seen the Russell Crowe Robin Hood, you've seen a fanciful version of kind of what led up to that. In 1215, what had happened was that Richard the Lionheart had gone off to fight in the Crusades in the Middle East, to fight against, to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. And so, as they saw it. And so he left behind his younger brother, John, who's also called Prince John, John Lackland, which is lack land, or John the Stupid. And I always said, if your brother's nickname is the Lionheart and your nickname is the Stupid, then you can kind of draw some conclusions about where the genetics landed in that family tree, right? So John the Stupid was not the greatest king. He's kind of the villain of like the Robin Hood stories. He's the Prince John is the one that had the Sheriff of Nottingham and Guy of Gisborne and all them working for him, doing bad stuff. He's the scrawny mean lion in the Disney cartoon. I believe it's been only about 50 years since I saw that when I was an infant, but So John did such a bad job of managing the country in the absence of his older brother that the nobles got together and basically drew up a list of, restrictions on his powers. And this is the first time that the subjects of a king got together and tried to limit his powers. Now, one thing I think is important to understand about this is not the regular normal people like you and me in England trying to limit the power of the king. This is the people just below, just below the king trying to limit his power over them. They weren't, I don't think, that worried about how he treated the regular people. They were worried about how he treated them. All right. So here's kind of an analogy. Imagine that the king is like the manager of Walmart, okay, that runs the whole store. This wasn't the checkout clerks and stock boys demanding to be treated better. This was the manager of electronics, the manager of automotive, the manager of lawn and garden or whatever, all getting together and saying, treat us better. So the Magna Carta has kind of a dual aspect to it. On the one hand, it's the first time people under the king tried to force him to treat them better. But on the other hand, it's not the normal people doing it. It's the people just slightly below the king, because you didn't have absolute monarchy yet. Those nobles had a whole lot of power. The king was kind of just like the most powerful of them. So, it's only a few years later that you start getting kings that claim they have 100% of the power. The nobles might as well all go home and be peasants, like Louis XIV, So, okay. So, this tries to restrict his power to some degree. It increases the power of the nobles relative to the king. It was forced on John the Stupid. John the First, by the nobility, not by the peasants. It was the first legal limitation of the monarch's powers, like I said, we can poo-poo it and say, well, it didn't really do that much. It really didn't do anything for the people, but it's a start because it puts England on the path to eventually having to sort of encapsulate their laws in a constitution. And they don't have, to this day, England doesn't have an actual constitution. They have what they call a virtual constitution, meaning that they have passed enough laws, that lay out everybody's power. It's kind of like if instead of a constitution, the United States instead had a bunch of laws that Congress passed back in the 1800s. That's not quite as secure as a document that can't be altered except through amendment, but it's what England chose to do. So they have a constitution basically made up of laws they've passed over hundreds of years. Okay. So it puts England on the path to being a constitutional monarchy. So out of this eventually comes Parliament in 1300. You need leverage over the king to get a concession like a parliament. And the leverage that they had was, you need our money. Because while the king might be on top, some of his nobles had more money than he did in their own coffers, in their own, vaults. And the king needed money. It's the same thing happens in France and basically touches off the French Revolution in 1789, many years later, is that when the king is running out of money, the royal treasury is getting low. The only place there, you can turn to the banks, maybe, or you may not even have banks back then. You turn to where the money is, and where the money was back then. Game of Thrones kind of actually touched on some of this, interestingly enough. It's why the Lannister family was so powerful, was they had all the money. They could finance, other houses when they were in charge, like the Baratheons, and then they could kind of take over and finance themselves as they did later on. But this is not Game of Thrones history, though I could teach that too. But it's the same idea. When the king needs money, the king has to go where the money is. Where was the money? With the most wealthy nobles. So the nobles are like, oh, we'll lend you some money if we can have a parliament. And so a parliament is created. And this, see, again, it's just like with the Magna Carta. It's not so much the specifics of it as what it means down the road. And what it means down the road is that the king would now have to rule alongside an elected body. Again, not the peasants, not the regular people yet. Parliament at that time was pretty much just those nobles having a place to sit down and tell the king, you don't get 100% your way. But over the years, of course, over many, many years, the lords, the House of Lords that was they added on a House of Commons for people like you and me. And then over many, many years, you see, the House of Commons is today the most powerful body in England and in Britain and the United Kingdom. But it didn't used to be. It had to spend many years working its way up. So that today, that sort of House of Lords that was created in 1300 is really just kind of an advisory body. The various hereditary lords today just kind of sit around in big chairs, smoking their pipe and drinking brandy and occasionally offering some advice, whereas the House of Commons is what actually runs Britain today. Okay, the next big thing that comes along in Europe is investiture. I'm going to zip through this pretty quickly. It's a big deal, but I think I can explain it relatively quickly here. In the 11th century, that's the 1000s, Pope Gregory VII of the Catholic Church decided that too many kings and emperors and princes around Europe were creating new office holders in the church. Like, in other words, the king of France maybe was making too many people bishops in France or giving them church powers. The Pope is like, that's my job, right? You can't name people to my church. I name people to my church. Because when the kings and emperors could name their own officials to the Catholic Church, you'd imagine they would be, those people, those new officials would have loyalty to the king that named them rather than to the Pope. And the Pope didn't like that. So the Pope says, no more of this. If you need a new bishop, you come to me and I'll send you one. Well, the kings and emperors don't like that. So the Holy Roman Emperor, kind of the most prominent political figure of that day, was Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, again, kind of a Germanic emperor. He wanted the kings of Europe to be able to continue to appoint church officials, because that was a great source of power and influence. So the Pope says, all right, Henry, get your butt over here to the Vatican and explain to me why you think this is okay. Now, again, the significance here is the Pope is demanding, summoning, you get over here now, young man, to an emperor, right? Now, up until this point, there hadn't been a real understanding who is more powerful. The understanding kind of was kings and emperors control your body. The Pope controls your soul. So you each have your own domains and you try not to meddle in each other's, right? The Pope tells you how to pray, how to not go to hell. The king or the emperor tells you how to obey the law and be a good subject in your kingdom. And then never the twain shall meet, right? You keep them separate, more or less. The separation of church and state idea that comes all the way down to our country today, right? But the Pope is now saying, I have more power over your subjects, emperor, than you do. The Pope is claiming a whole lot more power here than was accustomed. Okay. And so Henry's like, excuse me, I've got to be summoned to you? Whoa, I don't think so. So he refuses. Now, what this does is it sets off a tug of war, or a peeing contest, shall we say, right? Which one of them can kind of bend the other to his will? Can the Pope force the emperor to come to him and say, oh, Holy Father, I'm sorry I was so insolent. Whatever you say, you're the boss. Or can the emperor force the Pope to come to him and say, oh, Your Majesty, clearly you rule your own empire. I don't. Whatever you say goes, right? We're suddenly, after years of them kind of coexisting generationally, right? Now these two are going to try to push it to the edge and see who can win. So Henry says, I have powers at my disposal. He gets some of the members of the church that were, for whatever reason, personally, politically against that pope to depose, meaning you're no longer the pope. We've kicked you out. We've taken away your license to pope, and we're going to elect a new pope. The pope says, I am still the pope. You don't have the power to do that. And what's more, you are now going to hell. That's the pope's ultimate power, is to play the excommunication card. You know, you are no longer in the church. And the understanding back then was, if you're kicked out of the Catholic Church, there's nowhere else to go. You are on the highway to hell, and you are in the fast lane of the highway to hell. Now think about this. If the Pope says that the emperor no longer is going to heaven, he's now going to hell and is no longer a member of the church, what's that going to do to all the nobles under that emperor? What's it going to do to the subjects? They're going to go, I don't want to follow an emperor that's going to hell. He must be illegitimate. We need to find a new emperor quick. This guy's going to hell. So that's not good for Henry. I mean, it's the Pope throwing down the second best card he has. Now you might say, well, what is more powerful than that? There's one card the Pope has that's even more powerful than excommunication. And that is the "you are literally the devil" card. That's the you are the Antichrist. So it's kind of like, if the Pope escalates to DEFCON 1, you know, DEFCON 2 is you're excommunicated. DEFCON 1, which is full nuclear war, you know, analogously, is you are literally the devil. You don't want that. Okay. So the Pope kicks Henry out of the church, and the people of the Holy Roman Empire stop listening to him. They stop obeying him because he's no longer a worthy person, you know. And so they start to almost overthrow him, because now they've basically got a license. The Pope has said, take him out. And so he has no choice. He goes to the Pope's winter headquarters. I forget what the city is. Maybe Aachen, I'm not sure. It says in your book. It doesn't matter. But the Pope was at a castle up in the mountains, and it's freezing cold and snowing. And the emperor and his minions show up, and they don't open the door for him. They make the Holy Roman Emperor wait outside in the snow for hours, freezing cold. And the Pope's like, I'm kind of busy right now. I'll see you in a little while, you know. Man. So finally, the Holy Roman Emperor, in sackcloth and ashes, meaning I've done terrible bad and I need to be forgiven, right, appears before the Pope. And I love this picture. They're like, right here, man, right here, kneel down before the Pope. And the Pope is like, kiss my ring, show me that that I'm the boss. And so he has to kneel down and kiss the Pope's ring and say, you're the boss. I was wrong. You were right. Smoochy, smoochy. So this controversy would abate a little bit now, but it would continue for 50 more years until finally the Concordat of Worms, a good German name, where they compromise that both of them can invest or name new church officials. But the Pope continued to grow in power during all this time. You can see the fancy. See, he wears 3 crowns. Say, I'm 3 times the king you guys are. Pope, I love that name, Pope Innocent III. He says that the Pope's authority is the sun, and kings are only the moons with reflected glory, right? In other words, the light comes from the sun and only reflects off the moon. Moon doesn't generate its own light. It's just like a mirror. So that's like a shot across the bow to all the kings and emperors and queens of Europe, saying, I'm the man. You guys just reflect my glory. So the popes aren't letting up. But what this really gives us in the long grand scheme of things is the beginnings of liberalism. Now, this doesn't mean liberalism like, you know, in the United States today. That's a very specific kind of liberalism. We mean like classical liberalism, which really means the growth of democracy and freedom and individual rights. Okay, that's what classic liberalism, classic conservatism, as a, you know, again, this is totally classic. When you put classic before it, you mean like the grand scheme, as opposed to current American conservatism, liberalism. That's a totally different thing. Okay. So classical conservatism means you obey the king, you obey the pope with complete authority. You have no authority at all. Classical liberalism means you have a little control over your own life. You can vote, maybe you have individual rights that can't be taken away, that kind of thing. Our country, and in fact, all of Western civilization, are based on the idea of classical liberalism. And this is really the beginnings of it. That the common people start to think maybe we'd be better off if neither the church nor the kings ran everything. We can still have them, but don't have them run everything in our lives. Okay, the other big crisis involving the popes and the kings and all is the Great Schism. In the late 14th century, so the 1300s, the French and the Italians had been electing popes for years, and the French were like, we're just as good a Catholics as they are. Why can't we have a French pope? And so a real falling out happens between Italy and France. And the French elect their own pope separate from the Italian pope. This cartoon really kind of sums it up well. You have Avignon was the city in France where a French pope would live. You can see France here underneath him. And Rome, of course, is where the Italian pope in Italy would live. And so not only did they each elect their own, they then declared the other. They went DEFCON 1, right? They declared the other as the Antichrist. So I want you to imagine being a good Catholic Christian in Europe during this time, and you follow the Pope. You may or may not believe he's infallible during these years, but you certainly believe he represents Jesus, represents God, represents the Christian church, and is beyond reproach. Suddenly you have two popes. Which one do you follow? Well, I guess I could follow either one, right? Oh no, because they both said that the other is the Antichrist, literally Satan. And so if you pick the wrong pope, you're following the devil. So people look at this and go, do these people even know what they're talking about? Where's their credibility now? We gave them all this credibility over the years. They don't even know which one's the pope and which one's the devil. So a council was formed to try to resolve this, and they elected a third pope. The problem is the first two didn't step down, so now you got three popes. So, and it's not even a clean division like the United States Civil War, the North and the South. In fact, you get the yellow areas here on this map were supporting interestingly supporting the Italian Pope, and the kind of brownish plum areas were supporting the French Pope. Now, the ironic thing about that is a lot of these yellow areas that supported the church in Rome would later go on to be, this is really the heartland of Protestantism, a few years later. Germany, Scandinavia, and England are like the hearts of Protestantism. Yet back then they supported the Pope in Rome, whereas the places that resisted Protestantism were France, Spain, Italy, Poland. All right. So in 1417, the Holy Roman Emperor calls a new council, removes all three. You needed to do that first. Get rid of the three you got, and then elect a new one. But so they settled it down by having a fourth pope in just a few years. But on the other hand, the conflict itself damaged the faith of Christians who said, we thought these people were practically infallible. Now we're not sure they even know what they're doing. Why should we give them our complete allegiance? And it undermined legitimacy of the church. So what I would say is this, I don't know that this necessarily created a lot of atheists in Europe. They didn't go that far, but it certainly fractured that previously solid Catholic foundation of Europe, and allowed for Protestantism, for Martin Luther to come around a few years later and be able to take root. Because if the Catholic Church had still been 100% solid under Europe, Martin Luther couldn't have scratched it. But because of what the church did to itself in the up to 1417, it put enough cracks in that foundation that Martin Luther was able, like a flower or a weed or a tree or whatever, I don't want to insult him, I'm just being neutral, to come up through the cracked foundation. So heresy and debate were at an all-time high, and the church doesn't want that. So during this time, the church begins to create new positions, including the friars, which is a word that really comes from frere, which is like father in French. So friar really kind of means father, but it comes to mean something on its own, which are these sort of roving monks. The Franciscan friars, their order, aided the poor. They went out and tried to help the poor. So God bless literally the Franciscan friars. The Dominicans, though, they fought heresy and gave us things like the Inquisition. These are the ones that tortured people to death, burned them alive, put them on the rack, did all kinds of horrible. Excuse me, hiccups. They were the ones that came up with all these absolutely horrific tortures. They found every way you could think of to damage and injure and torture a human body. Pretty horrible stuff. So that's what the Dominicans did. And they also, the church established universities all across Europe, as you can see here, mostly as theological institutes originally. But this is where, secular education kind of emerges eventually. So the Inquisitions, as I said, were one of the Dominicans' tools. And then, like I said, the universities were mostly for clergy at that point, because at that point in history, most education was religious education. You got some math and some science on the side, but you're really there learning how to be a priest, studying Latin, that kind of thing. And it was completely controlled by the church. All right, so there's the Inquisition denouncing somebody in front of the Pope or the holy judges. And then you get tortured if you're denounced. Confess. Normally at this point in class, I would show you Monty Python's Spanish Inquisition clip on YouTube. It's very funny. The threes. Uh-oh. Sorry, had a little freeze. Sometimes my computer does weird things. Let me check the audio. Sometimes that messes up the audio. Anyway, I said normally under these at this point in the class, I would show you the Spanish Inquisition on YouTube, the Monty Python bit with Michael Palin, where they wear their red robes and hat, and they're like, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. But I'll let you, if you want to check that out on YouTube, it's pretty funny. One of their classic bits about making fun of the Spanish Inquisition, because the Spanish were really gung-ho. And you might say, well, why were the Spanish particularly bad about this? I think it's because, other parts of Europe, the heresy was like a minority. It was people, on the streets that maybe didn't agree with the Catholic Church all the time. But remember, Spain and Portugal had actually been under Muslim control for centuries. So as the Christians began to retake Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, they wanted to purge not just heresy, but purge all the Islamic influence out. So they went to great lengths with the Spanish Inquisition, with Torquemada. Okay, in Russia, there hadn't been a Russia really previously. There'd been that little area around Novgorod and Kiev and all that, but it's been growing. It was called Kiev Rus during that time. That's where the name Russia comes from, the Rus people. Kiev Rus broke up in the 11th century, and instead Russian civilization would now focus around the city of Moscow, which of course will go on to be the capital, the central location of the Russian Empire. And I think I mentioned this before, didn't I, that Moscow considered itself the third Rome because they were the recipients of Byzantine culture. Remember, the emperors in Constantinople had sent their daughters, and they'd sent Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. I think we talked about this, right? And so if Russia had a European Christian culture at this point, it was almost entirely because of the Byzantines. And that's why, again, their alphabet looks different from ours. It's why they are Orthodox Christians instead of Catholics, because they got all their influence from the Byzantine Empire rather than from Western Europe and Rome. And there's that two-headed symbol of the Byzantine Empire looking toward Europe, looking toward Russia, which is adopted by Russia as their imperial crest because Russia looks toward Europe and toward Asia. Ivan the Great in 1462 consolidated the beginnings of modern Russia. He was the first fully Russian monarch. He drove out the last of the Mongols, defeated their last few armies, married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. So this really represents the transition of that Roman culture to this Romanov dynasty in Russia. Adopted that Byzantine symbol for Russia. That's actually on their soccer jerseys today. For like 85 years or whatever, it was the Soviet Union and it was the Communist Party, the hammer and sickle. But today they've gone back to the old Romanov logo. And they would have a czar, which is just a Russian corruption of Caesar. Just like the Germans would have a Kaiser, which is a German corruption of Caesar. Everybody wants to be Caesar. Everybody wants to be the Roman Empire. I said this a million times. Napoleon will do it later. Okay, famine and Black Death. In the early 1300s, there's a climate change. We get the Little Ice Age. We don't know, maybe volcanoes erupted or something and blocked the sun for a few years. And so there were lower harvests and starvation. And of course, when there's lower harvests and starvation, people are sickly, people are dying, and any disease that comes along will just be that much worse. And of course, the most horrible disease, probably until the Spanish flu comes along, the Black Death, which was a combination of two diseases. It probably came out of Central Asia. It seems like everything does, doesn't it? It spread to Europe by the Mongols, also by Italian merchants traveling by ship. You know, one of the first places it hit was in, my audio doing something funny? I'm just very paranoid. One of the first places it hit was where there were ports like Marseille and Athens and all down in here. And then it spreads from the ports. Never really got Warsaw for some reason. Germany, Poland were pretty lucky, but it went everywhere else. It was carried by rats carrying fleas that had the germs. They didn't understand that. Here's Bruegel's famous painting of just like the reign of death, you know, skeletons killing people and all. It's just like it's a skeleton cutting off a guy's head up there. It's just a fanciful way of saying that death ruled Europe during the Black Plague. One of the versions was the bubonic plague. This was more common. These, by the way, these are both caused by bacteria. So if they'd had antibiotics, they could have cured everybody. Imagine that. But they didn't know. You know, the thing we have now, the COVID thing, is a virus, and there's no cure. Vaccines just help the body kill it, but there's no literal, you know, destroyer of it. Medicine. Even a vaccine doesn't kill a virus. It just helps your body kill it more efficiently. Whereas with bacteria, you take antibiotics and the antibiotics kill the bacteria. So they could have killed this if they'd had penicillin, but they didn't. So it was more common. It caused these black blisters on your skin and your joints swelled up. And within a couple of days, you were dead in agony. It was a horrible way to go. But the other one wasn't much better, called pneumonic, meaning like when something's pneumonic or pneumatic, it means like the lungs, the air. This is the one that is kind of like COVID in terms of how it spread. People would cough or sneeze. It would go out in the air. If they'd worn masks, you know, and social distance, you wouldn't have had so much pneumonic plague. It's true. It was even, in other words, it killed people. Bubonic plague, if you got that, you might actually live. You'd be in agony and be swollen and stuff, but you might actually live. In fact, the Emperor Justinian of Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, he actually got it and lived. But the pneumonic plague pretty much is 100% terminal rate. So there's just dragging all the dead bodies out into the streets. They didn't know what to do with all the bodies. And there's the waves again of it moving through in the 14th century. From the 1347 to 49, it was just ravaged Europe, killed perhaps somewhere around half the people of Europe died of it. Just amazing. What's amazing is it wasn't more than that. I guess if you locked yourself in your house and had food and water for a few years, you might survive it. But and didn't have fleas, but you know, everybody had animals living right there with them, basically in their homes. Two more times the next 2 centuries, it was blamed on, of course, everything except germs. God punishing the wicked, except that it wasn't just wicked people that were dying; it was everybody. The devil, of course, what's he going to do? Devil's like, I think I'm going to unleash a plague. Or Jews, because they were always blamed for everything. And so there was a lot of violent anti-Semitism. It's all the Jews' fault. All right, last couple of topics, I believe. And eventually it kind of goes away. It still pops up to this day. I mean, the bubonic plague still popped up like a few weeks ago. But again, nowadays we can cure it very rapidly and jump on it if you diagnose it early enough, I guess. Okay, so the 100 Years' War sounds complicated, but it's really not. Here's the deal with the 100 Years' War. You remember earlier I described how the Norman conquest meant that Normans from France, and that meant like French Vikings royalty, crossed over and defeated the Saxon Germanic people of England. And so you get the England became ruled by the Normans and the Angles and the Saxons. You have this Norman Anglo-Saxon England. And the royalty then, after William the Conqueror, was mostly Norman. They all had family ties back to France. So over the years, the rulers of England with these French family ties back to France begin to think, we have more right to rule France than the people currently ruling France do. Like after enough, kids and grandkids die, the King of England starts thinking, my connections to France are more powerful than the current French king's connection to France. So that's going to touch off this 100-year period of warfare between England and France, where England keeps trying to assert its control over France as being more valid than French control over France. And honestly, there are arguments to be made both ways. It's not absurd. It's a valid thing. So it's a war in France, again, a little over 100 years, 1337 to 1453. It was lucky for the English that it was fought almost entirely in France. It never came back across to England. The English kings, to sum up what I just said, the English kings claim French lands and crown as their own, as they have a better claim than the French do to the French rule. Again, it sounds crazy to us today, but again, these families were so intermarried that it could have legitimately been true. In fact, in some cases, it probably was. I would argue that Henry VI, which we'll see in just a minute, Henry VI had a better claim. Henry VI of England had a better claim to the French throne than Henry VII of England had to the English throne. That sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true. I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So the English actually invaded France in the 1300s. They sent armies over to militarily conquer France to put their king in charge. And their king went with them as like the top general. And that would be Henry V here. And Henry V, Henry particularly at Agincourt, but the English won these two big victories at Crécy and Agincourt, both of which consolidated over the years English control over at least a big portion of France. So some parts of France were fighting back, and some parts were saying, let's just be ruled by the English. They're probably more legitimate. So the reason that the English were able, in smaller numbers, were able to defeat the French knights at Crécy and Agincourt, that the English had developed a longbow, this great big, literally a long bow with these long arrows. They would get down on their knees and fire them like launching a missile almost, firing a mortar shell. And these great long arrows would come off these long bows with such force that they could penetrate the armor of the knights. Now, let me remind you, last week I talked about that armor. I said, remember, if you were nobility in Europe, you got a suit of armor, and that suit of armor meant that you were pretty much Iron Man. No regular person could hurt you until now. See, they thought, the people of Europe thought that a nobleman having armor and a peasant not therefore being able to hurt him was God's will. This was God saying, peasants, do not rise up against your lords and masters because you cannot physically harm them in their armor. Well, now suddenly everything is upside down because commoners with these really powerful bows are able to shoot arrows into French noblemen in armor and kill them. There were people who said, these English weapons are ungodly. This is like the work of the devil that a commoner can kill a nobleman. But of course, another way to look at it is, this is the rise of the regular people rising up and challenging being controlled by these aristocratic overlords. Just depends on how you look at it, as with most things. All right, so the French, this is incredible. The Battle of Agincourt, the movie Henry V goes through it. The French had 20,000 knights in the field, and there were about 900 Englishmen. And the 900 Englishmen with longbows killed almost all 20,000 of those, and they lost about 25 Englishmen in return. Unbelievable. Most lopsided victory in history. And of course, the English took this to mean that God wanted them to win. So they should rule France. So Henry V would control much of France. Problem is, he was a brilliant king, brilliant military commander, and he died of a fever. You know how people were always dropping dead back then of whatever germs. He died of a fever while still in France. He had married a French princess to consolidate his rule, and they had one little boy, one son. So here's how France was divided up over time. The English conquered all of this, plus Crécy, Calais, Agincourt is right up in here. There it is on the coast. And this is what they lost. The other really important figure in all this, okay, so Henry V dies and leaves his son, Henry VI, crowned as King of England and France, the only king ever to be crowned King of England and France at the same time, in France and in England. Crowned as an infant, couldn't rule the country, was an infant, and so people ruled it on his behalf. And as Shakespeare said at the end of Henry V, Shakespeare says, in infant bands crowned King of England and of France, of whose kingdoms so many had the managing, that they did lose France and make his England bleed. So not only does this cause the English to lose everything they'd gained in France, it also causes a civil war called the Wars of the Roses back home, which we're about to get to as our very last thing. So the English mismanaged France, and then as the rebellion in France is rising up, a woman, interestingly enough back then, Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc, rises up and hears the voice of God telling her, go out and lead the French to victory. And the French are like, what the heck? What have we got to lose this point? Let's follow this woman. And she leads them to victory. She then rallies the French to victory, but she's captured by French military officers that were in league with the English. And they said the only way this woman could be doing this is if she's in league with the devil. Of course, no woman could ever be winning militarily, so it has to be the devil. And so they capture her and burn her at the stake as a heretic. And because she also said she heard the voice of God, which they said only the Pope, can hear the voice of God or whatever. So they burn her at the stake. And she is a French hero, and she is a saint in the Catholic Church. And there she is. All right, so last topic is the Wars of the Roses. So with England having lost their French possessions, the ruling family, which was at this point the Lancasters, they were one branch of this Plantagenet dynasty. They kind of fell on ill repute, right? They couldn't even hang on to France. And so another royal family, the Yorks, see, the Lancasters were represented by the Red Rose. So let me explain what this is. These are English civil wars from 1455 to 87. The Yorks were were like the cousins of the Lancasters. The York dynasty was represented by the White Rose, the Lancasters by the Red Rose, so it's the Wars of the Roses. And so the York said, when you guys were leading us to victory, we would follow you. But now you're losing, and so we think that really probably we should take over because honestly, we have a better claim to the throne than you do. Isn't it kind of ironic that the Lancasters said we have a better claim to the French throne than the French do? And yet the Yorks are like, well, we have a better claim to the English throne than you do. Oh. So these two families start to fight. They're both two factions of the same big family, the Plantagenet dynasty. So they claim the throne of England. They fought each other. And then just to kind of run through what happens, and you can read it in the text if you want, or you can watch the Shakespeare plays. But Henry VI is the one that was crowned as an infant. He was Henry V's little boy. His mother was a French princess. He was crowned King of England and of France at the same time. But he was such a weak weak king. And again, he was trying to rule when he was a little boy, and it just wasn't working out. He was very weak. And so he's the one the Yorks rise up against. They loved his dad, right? But his dad is dead and he is weak. And so the Yorks now rise up against him. And the leader of the York family ultimately becomes Edward IV. They arrest Henry VI. They lock him up in the Tower of England to decide what to do with him. And Edward of York is crowned Edward IV, King of England. He actually rules very wisely and well for several years. He's considered probably the great York king. This story, by the way, is told in those miniseries, the White Queen and the White Princess, I believe, and all that. And so Edward IV rules for a while, but then he dies. And the middle brother, there were three brothers, Edward, George, and Richard. This is Richard, the youngest brother. So that's the oldest York brother and the youngest York brother. So Edward dies. George is actually executed. It's complicated. I'm not going to go into it. So the only brother left alive is Richard. Now, here's the controversial part. You would think, yeah, of course, Richard becomes king because he's the younger brother and the older brother died. Except Edward had two little boys. Edward had two little boys. And when he died, Richard said, oh, I have to take care of them that nothing happens to them. So Richard has the two princes locked up in the Tower of England where they had locked up Henry. And by the way, when Henry was locked up there, he mysteriously died. Well, now Richard locks up Edward's two little boys in the tower, and they vanish. They are one of the history's mysteries. They've never been seen again. Some people say Richard sent in his flunkies to murder those little boys so there would be no challenge to his reign. People that believe that consider Richard a monster and the worst king ever and just a total villain. Shakespeare was with them. If you watch or read Richard III, that play, at the very beginning, Richard comes out, looks at the audience and says, he basically, let me translate it for modern languages. Richard comes out and says, y'all, I'm a villain and I'm about to do villain stuff. Hold my beer. That's basically how that play starts, okay? But others would argue that Richard didn't murder the kids and was a good king and did the best he could. So it really just depends which side you stand on about Richard III. Very controversial. In any case, enough people thought he was a murderer and a monster that when this guy showed up, oops, I must have hit the stupid button. Hold on. This guy shows up from France. His name was also Henry. He shows up with an army, and when he does, and I'll tell you who he is in a second, a whole bunch of Richard's people switch sides and support him because they've really lost faith in Richard. And so he defeats and kills Richard III. They just found Richard's body buried under a parking lot in England a few years ago. They found Richard's body. Richard was the last English king to die in battle. He went out to fight against Henry VII, and they fought each other in battle. Richard died and was buried there on the battlefield, and Henry becomes the new king, and Henry marries Edward's daughter. Remember, the two little boys were dead, but there was a daughter. And so Henry marries her and establishes what would be called the Tudor line that would give us Bloody Mary and Henry VIII famously and Queen Elizabeth famously. It's a very short dynasty, but a very famous one. And as I said, his legitimacy to me was always very much in question because I believe his mother or his grandmother was that French princess, that had married Henry V. So his claim to his father was like a Welsh peasant, Tudor. That's where that name came from. So in any case, Henry VII, kind of a shaky claim, but his family was very successful. And he abolishes the private armies of the lords and basically sets England on the path to having a very powerful king or queen. And then, of course, about that same time, Columbus discovers America, which takes us into World Civ II. Boom. All right. We are done. So you've now seen the two parts of medieval Europe. That, along with the two pieces before, it'll be what are on the test. if you haven't already taken it. I'm assuming if you're watching this now, you haven't already taken it. I don't think hardly anybody has. Now, remember, you've got until like midnight this coming Friday. So you don't have the usual you had from last Friday, but from now, you only have a few days. So please study well, prepare yourself, and then go and take it. It's got like 50 questions, multiple choice, and then your essay. And in fact, I will end by telling you kind of what the essay choices are, and that'll be the last thing, and then we're going to wrap up. So your essay options, you're going to pick one of these. The first one involves the Byzantine Empire. There's a section on them. The second involves Islam, which there's that section on them. And the third involves major events or dynasties in Europe. So in other words, the third option is from this last big medieval Europe. So it's kind of open-ended. It lets you pick a couple of that you want to kind of talk about and ask specific questions. All right. So there's your final exam, and there's the material that'll be on it. I hope you got something out of our online summer class, and I'll hopefully see you guys in just a couple of weeks back in the classroom. We'll make the best of it. We'll be masked up and everything, but we'll make the best of it in the classroom, and it'll be nice to be able to interact with you directly, at least somewhat. And if you're signed up for one of my classes for fall, I'll be sending out or posting syllabi very soon, and it'll include what days people are supposed to show up, because we can't have but half the class there every other day. All right, enjoy the rest of the summer, and I'll see you guys soon. Take it easy, everybody.